On the afternoon of August 18, 1979, in front of 2,147 people at the Buchanan County Fair in Independence, Iowa, a man named Dale Pressler made the most expensive mistake of his life. He did it in public, he did it loudly, and he did it with the absolute confidence of a man who has never once been wrong about anything that mattered. $10,000, Dale announced, loud enough for half the grandstand to hear. He was holding the bills in the air, fanning them slightly, making sure everyone could see. $10,000 cash says that piece of junkyard scrap doesn't make it halfway down the track. The piece of junkyard scrap he was pointing at was a 1961 Farmall 560 that hadn't been washed in a decade. Its red paint had faded to something closer to dried blood. There was a dent in the hood from where a hay bale had fallen on it in 1972. The left rear fender was held on with baling wire. Someone had once told the owner he could get $150 for it as scrap metal, and that had seemed optimistic. The man standing next to the Farmall was named Eugene Holtz. He was 44 years old and hadn't raised his voice in public since his wedding day. He looked at Dale Pressler. He looked at the money being waved in the air. And then he said 4 words that would be repeated in Buchanan County for the next 40 years. "I'll take that bet." The crowd went silent. Then someone in the grandstand laughed, then someone else. Within 30 seconds, 2,000 people were looking at Eugene Holtz like he had lost his mind entirely. And maybe on paper he had, because on paper this was not a contest. This was not even close to a contest. Dale Pressler's John Deere 4440 was the most advanced tractor money could buy in 1979. Brand new, straight from the dealership in Waterloo, with a turbocharged 466 cubic inch diesel engine producing over 130 horsepower, power shift transmission, factory air conditioning, a sound-dampened cab that cost more than most farmers in Buchanan County made in a year. The sticker price was north of $45,000. Eugene's Farmall 560 was 18 years old, naturally aspirated, 6 cylinders, maybe 60 horsepower on a good day, and Eugene hadn't seen many good days lately. He had bought it used in 1967 for $2,800, and by August of 1979 it had logged over 9,000 hours of hard work across his 280-acre operation. It was, by every visible measure, exactly what Dale Pressler called it. Junkyard scrap. But there was something Dale Pressler did not know about that tractor. Something Eugene had never told a single person. Something discovered by accident in the winter of 1971 when Eugene pulled the engine apart to replace a cracked head gasket and found components inside that had no business being in a standard Farmall 560. In about 15 minutes, the whole county was going to find out. Let me tell you about these 2 men first, because this story is not really about tractors. It is about pride. It is about what happens when a man with money mistakes wealth for worth. And it is about a lesson that cost Dale Pressler everything he had built and then some. Dale Pressler came from what people in Buchanan County called old money, which in Iowa farming terms meant his grandfather had bought 800 acres during the Depression for pennies on the dollar when other men were losing their shirts. By 1979, the Pressler family owned over 2,200 acres of prime northeast Iowa farmland, and Dale had spent most of his adult life making sure that everyone within a 30-mile radius knew it. He drove a new truck every 2 years. He wore boots that cost more than most farmers' church suits. He sat on the county board, the co-op board, and the church finance committee, not because he cared particularly about any of those things, but because he liked seeing his name on plaques and liked being in rooms where decisions were made. Every time a neighbor struggled, every time a farm went to auction, Dale Pressler was there with his checkbook and his smile, picking up the pieces at a discount. It was not cruelty exactly. It was the habit of a man who had learned early that other people's misfortune, managed carefully, could become his opportunity. Eugene Holtz was a different kind of man entirely. His family had come to Iowa in 1919, refugees from a failed homestead in Nebraska. His grandfather had worked as a hired hand for 15 years before saving enough to buy 160 acres of his own. Eugene's father had expanded that to 280 acres by the time he died in 1965. Leaving everything to his only son. Eugene had spent the 14 years since doing exactly what his father and grandfather had done, working the land, paying his bills, keeping his head down. He didn't sit on any boards, he didn't go to many meetings. He spent most of his time in the barn or the fields, and he was more comfortable talking to his equipment than to most people. The Farmall 560 had been the first tractor his father ever let him drive, back in 1962 when Eugene was 17 years old. He had learned to plow on that machine, learned to cultivate, learned to understand what an engine was telling you through the sound it made and the way it pulled under load. When his father died, Eugene kept the Farmall running, not because he couldn't afford something newer, but because that tractor understood his land in a way that newer equipment would take years to learn. And then there was the secret. The thing Eugene had found in the winter of 1971 and never told anyone because there was no particular reason to tell anyone. The farm all did what he needed it to do. Until August 18, 1979, when Dale Pressler bet $10,000 against it. But I will get to that. Let me tell you about the county fair first, because that is where everything began to change. The Buchanan County Fair tractor pull had been a tradition since the early 1950s. It was not the biggest pull in Iowa. That honor went to the state fair in Des Moines, but it was big enough to fill the grandstands and bring competitors from 3 counties. The rules were straightforward. Each tractor pulled a weighted sled down a 300-foot track. The sled had a mechanism that transferred weight progressively forward as it moved, making it harder to pull with each foot of distance gained. Whoever pulled the farthest one, a full pull, taking the sled all the way to the 300-foot mark, moved you to the next round with added weight on the sled. Eugene had not entered the tractor pull in years. He had competed in the late 1960s when his father was still alive and the old man liked watching. After his father died, Eugene lost interest in most things not directly related to keeping the farm running. So when he showed up at the registration table on the morning of August 18th, people were surprised. When they saw what he planned to compete with, they were confused. "Eugene," said Dorothy, the registration clerk who had known him since grade school. "You know this is the open class. You're going up against some serious iron." "I know. That Farmall, it's got to be what, 18 years old." 18, she runs fine." Dorothy looked past him at the Farmall parked in the staging area, rust streaks down the hood, exhaust stack black with carbon. She looked back at Eugene with something close to pity. "Well," she said, "it's your entry fee." Eugene paid the $25 and went to wait with the other competitors. Dale Pressler had won the Buchanan County tractor pull 3 years running, 1976, 1977, and 1978, with his previous John Deere 4330. This year he had upgraded to the more powerful 4440 and expected to make it 4 in a row without particular difficulty. When he saw Eugene's name on the competitor list, he thought someone was making a joke. When he walked over to the staging area and actually saw the Farmall, the joke became material. "Eugene Holtz," Dale said, loud enough for the dozen other competitors to hear. "I didn't know they were letting museum pieces compete this year." A few men laughed. Eugene didn't say anything. Dale walked a slow circle around the Farmall, making a production of the examination. He kicked one tire, shook his head, clicked his tongue. "You know what this tractor's worth, Eugene? About $150, and that's if you sold it for scrap." He turned to one of the other competitors, a farmer named Howard Vance. "How much did that new cab cost on your 4440, Dale?" $12,000, Dale said, answering his own question. "But worth every penny. Climate control, sound dampening. I could pull all day and never break a sweat." Howard made a neutral sound. Howard was farming 320 acres with a 10-year-old Oliver and was not entirely sure he was going to make his loan payment in the fall. He had noticed things about Dale Pressler over the years that Dale Pressler had never noticed about himself. Dale turned back to Eugene. "Tell you what, I'll give you $500 for that tractor right now. Cash, walk away, save yourself the embarrassment. I'll put it in my barn as a conversation piece." Eugene looked at him for a long moment. "Not for sale." "Not for sale?" Dale laughed. "Eugene, in 2 hours that thing won't be worth the diesel in its tank." "We'll see," Eugene said. "Now let me ask you something. Have you ever been so certain of something that you genuinely could not construct a scenario in your mind where you were wrong? Not arrogantly certain, not pretending, but certain the way you are certain that the sun will come up tomorrow, that water is wet, that gravity works?" That was Dale Pressler in the staging area that afternoon. The outcome was so obvious to him that betting $10,000 on it felt less like gambling and more like collecting money that was already his. He was not nervous when he announced the bet. He was excited. He was already composing the story he would tell at the diner and the co-op meeting and the church social. The easy money he had taken off the county's quietest farmer and his museum peace tractor. Pride sets traps. It builds them carefully and covers them well and positions them directly in the path of the men who most need to fall into them. Dale Pressler had just stepped into the biggest one of his life. The open class was scheduled for 4, 30 in the afternoon after the lighter divisions had finished. By the time the big tractors lined up, the August heat had every person in the grandstand sweating through their shirts and the shadows were just beginning to stretch. 15 tractors in the open class. Dale's 4440 was the clear favorite, but there were other serious machines, 2 case tractors, an International 1466, a Massey Ferguson that had been modified for competition. Eugene's Farmall 560 was the oldest tractor in the lineup by at least a decade. It was also the smallest. The format was elimination. Each tractor pulled once. The 8 best distances advanced to the finals where they pulled again with 2,000 additional pounds on the sled. Eugene drew the 8th position, Dale drew 12th. The first 7 tractors posted distances ranging from 187 feet to a full 300-foot pull. The International 1466 got the full pull. One of the case machines matched it. The crowd was in good spirits, cheering the strong pulls, groaning sympathetically at the ones that fell short. Then it was Eugene's turn. He climbed onto the Farmall and started the engine. It caught on the first turn of the key, a deep, healthy rumble that was noticeably different from the sound a 60-horsepower tractor had any right to make. A few people near the track glanced up from their conversations. Eugene let it warm up for a minute, then pulled forward and hooked to the sled. The track judge gave the signal. Eugene eased the clutch out. For the first 100 feet it looked like any other pull, the tractor straining forward, the sled getting heavier as the weight transferred, the engine working harder. At 150 feet a few people started paying closer attention. At 200 feet the crowd was interested. At 250 feet people were standing. The Farmall's engine was screaming. A sound that was too large for the machine making it, a sound that did not match the rust and the dents and the baling wire holding the fender on. The exhaust stack was shooting black smoke. The rear tires were digging into the clay track, throwing arcs of dirt. 275 feet. 290 feet. The Farmall crossed the 300-foot line with the sled still moving behind it. Full pull. The grandstand erupted. People were cheering and grabbing each other and pointing at the scoreboard and pointing at the old red tractor and looking at each other with the expression people wear when they have just seen something their understanding of the world did not prepare them for. Eugene drove back to the staging area like nothing unusual had happened. He shut off the engine, climbed down, and walked to the water cooler without looking at anyone. Dale Pressler was standing 20 feet away. For the first time in as long as anyone in Buchanan County could remember, he was not smiling. Now let me tell you the secret, because it explains what happened on that track and it is one of the finest hidden jokes in the history of Iowa agriculture. The Farmall 560 was manufactured between 1958 and 1963 with a standard 263 cubic inch 6-cylinder engine rated at approximately 60 horsepower. A reliable, honest tractor, nothing exceptional. But Eugene's Farmall was not stock. When he pulled the head off the engine in the winter of 1971, he found components that did not match any specification sheet he had ever seen. The cylinders had been bored out. The pistons were heavier with a higher compression ratio. The camshaft had a profile he did not recognize. Someone had done serious, professional engine work on this machine, and they had not done it to make it a standard 560. Eugene made phone calls, he dug through records. Eventually he found the answer. His Farmall had been a factory test mule. In 1962, International Harvester was developing what would become the Farmall 706, a larger, more powerful machine intended to replace the 560 series. To test the new engine designs before committing to production tooling, they modified a batch of existing 560s with prototype components. Most of those test mules were scrapped after the evaluation was complete. But one of them found its way to a dealership in Cedar Rapids, where it was sold in 1967 as a standard used 560 to Eugene's father. The modifications had pushed the output from 60 horsepower to somewhere between 85 and 90. Not enough to race a new 4440 on the highway, but enough, in the right hands, to do things that a standard 560 had no business doing. Eugene's father had never known. He had simply thought he had bought a tractor that ran remarkably well. Eugene had worked out the truth in 1971 and kept it to himself because there was no reason not to. The Farmall did what he needed it to do and he saw no purpose in advertising the fact. Until Dale Pressler bet $10,000 against it. The finals began at 5:30 with the sun dropping toward the western horizon and the shadows stretching long and golden across the track. 8 tractors had advanced. Both Case machines, the International, the Massey, Dale's John Deere, and to a murmur of astonishment from the crowd, Eugene's Farmall 560. The sled now carried 2,000 additional pounds. The first 4 tractors posted distances of 235, 251, 247, and 268 feet respectively. Good pulls, serious numbers. Then it was Eugene's turn again. The Farmall hooked to the sled. Eugene gave it throttle, that same deep, improbable sound from an engine that was carrying a secret nobody knew. At 200 feet, the sled was getting heavy. At 250 feet, the rear tires were spinning and catching and spinning again. At 275 feet, the tractor looked like it might stall. But Eugene had been driving this machine for 17 years. He knew it the way you know the sound of your own name, the precise feel of the throttle at the edge of its range, the exact moment to shift his weight to keep the rear wheels gripping the clay, the particular engine note that meant he was at the limit and still holding. He worked all of it simultaneously, the way experienced men work the tools of their trade without thinking about each individual movement. 287 feet. The Farmall stopped. Engines straining, tires smoking, the entire machine trembling with effort. Not a full pull, but 287 feet was the best distance of the finals by 19 feet. Dale Pressler climbed into his 4440 with the posture of a man who has already decided the outcome. The John Deere started with the smooth, powerful rumble of $45,000 worth of modern engineering. Dale hooked to the sled, got the signal, and hit the throttle. The machine pulled strong, 100 feet, 150 feet, 200 feet. The crowd was watching the scoreboard, watching Dale's face, watching the distance markers. 260 feet. At 278 feet, the rear tires lost traction. Dale tried to recover, shifted his weight forward, adjusted the throttle, worked the machine with everything he had. The sled had stopped. The John Deere was spinning its wheels in place, going nowhere. The distance marker stood at 278 feet. 9 feet short of Eugene's mark. The silence that followed lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then the crowd began to murmur, then to talk, then to shout. People were pointing at the scoreboard, pointing at the Farmall sitting quietly in the staging area, pointing at Dale Pressler's face as the arithmetic completed itself in his expression. The remaining 2 tractors both failed to beat 287 feet. When the announcer called the results, Eugene Holtz and his 1961 Farmall 560 had won the Buchanan County Fair Open Class Tractor Pull. First place prize, $500 and a trophy. Eugene walked over to where Dale Pressler was standing and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, a receipt he had written up that morning before leaving the farm, because Eugene was the kind of man who thought ahead about the things he was going to need. "I'll take that $10,000 now," he said quietly. The crowd was watching, all of it. Every person who had laughed when Eugene said "I'll take that bet" was watching now to see what kind of man Dale Pressler really was when the arithmetic went the wrong way. Dale's face went red, his jaw tightened. For a moment it looked like he might try to find some angle, some technicality, some way out. But there were 2,000 witnesses and he had announced the bet loud enough for half the grandstand to hear it, and the only thing worse than paying would be not paying. Dale reached into his jacket, pulled out his checkbook, wrote a check for $10,000, handed it to Eugene without looking at him. Eugene took it, folded it, put it in his pocket. He didn't smile, he didn't say anything. He just nodded once, turned around, and walked back to his tractor. That night, Eugene Holtz became a legend in Buchanan County. And Dale Pressler's reputation, the one he had spent 30 years constructing, brick by careful brick, began its long, slow, comprehensive collapse. Let me tell you what happened after, because the story does not end at the fairgrounds, and the tractor pull was only the beginning of what this afternoon cost Dale Pressler. Dale did not handle the loss well. He had been humiliated in front of 2,000 people by a man he had publicly dismissed, forced to write a check in front of witnesses who would tell the story for decades. Within a month he had become a punchline. People would grin at him across the feed store counter. "Hey Dale, you want to bet on that?" Dale stopped going to the diner, stopped going to the co-op meetings. Spent more time in his office and less time in public, which was perhaps the worst possible response, because it gave the story more air to breathe than his presence would have. In October of 1979, 2 months after the pull, Dale Pressler bought 400 more acres of land. He paid $2,600 an acre, financed entirely through the bank. When people asked why he needed more land when he was already farming 2,200 acres, he said it was a good investment. But the truth was simpler and sadder. He was trying to prove something. Trying to demonstrate that the biggest farmer in Buchanan County was still the biggest farmer in Buchanan County, even if some quiet man with a rusted tractor had taken $10,000 from him on a hot August afternoon. It was, in retrospect, the worst possible decision at the worst possible time. You know what happened to Iowa agriculture in the early 1980s? Interest rates climbed to 21.5%. Land values began falling off the cliff they had been climbing throughout the 1970s. Grain prices collapsed. Farmers who had borrowed against their land during the boom years found themselves owing more than everything they owned was worth. Dale Pressler had borrowed heavily for the 400 acres and before that for equipment and buildings and operating expenses. By 1982, he owed the bank close to $800,000. His collateral was worth perhaps half that. The numbers did not work no matter how many times he ran them. Eugene Holtz had no debt. His father had retired the last family loan in 1950 and Eugene had never borrowed a dime since. He lived carefully. He spent carefully. He saved what he could. When the crisis hit, he tightened his belt and waited the way men who have grown up understanding that bad years come due when the bad years arrive. The $10,000 from the bet went straight into a savings account. He never touched it. He said later that it didn't feel like his money. It felt like a lesson he was supposed to hold on to. By 1985, Dale Pressler was facing foreclosure. The bank had sent the letters. The lawyers had filed the paperwork. The auction was scheduled for March 15th. Dale had tried everything: refinancing, selling pieces of the operation, calling in every favor he had accumulated over 30 years of being the most important farmer in the county. Nothing worked. The arithmetic had stopped being his friend and was not going to start again. 3 days before the auction, Eugene Holtz drove up Dale's driveway. Dale's wife Martha answered the door. Her eyes were red. She had been crying for weeks. "Eugene," she said, surprised enough to say his name before she could compose herself. "Dale's not seeing anyone right now." "I know," Eugene said. "I'd like to talk to him for just a minute." Martha stepped aside. Dale was in the living room, staring at the wall. He looked like a man who had aged a decade in 6 months. When he saw Eugene, something moved across his face that had several things in it at once: shame and anger and resignation, all competing for the same territory. "Come to gloat," Dale said. He didn't get up. Eugene sat down in the chair across from him and held his cap in his hands. "Came to talk," he said. "I've got a proposition. I'll pay off your bank loan, all of it. In exchange, you deed me 600 acres, the original Pressler ground, the land your grandfather bought." Dale stared at him. "That's half the farm." "I know. That's close to $400,000. $380,000 according to the bank. I talked to them yesterday." Dale's mouth opened and closed. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why would you do that?" Eugene was quiet for a moment, looking at the cap in his hands. Then he looked up. "Because my father taught me that a man isn't measured by what he takes. He's measured by what he gives back. And because that day at the fair, the $10,000, it was never about the money. It was about respect. You treated me like I was nothing, my tractor like it was nothing. 50 years of my family's work like it didn't matter because I wasn't driving a new John Deere." He paused. "I wanted you to see that you were wrong. That's all I ever wanted. I didn't want to destroy you. I didn't want your children to lose their home." Dale wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "And if I say yes, what then?" "Then you keep farming. You've got 1,600 acres left, plus the buildings and equipment. That's enough to make a living if you're careful, if you stop trying to be the biggest and start trying to be the smartest." Eugene stood up and put his cap back on. "You've got until tomorrow morning to decide. After that, I'm buying at the auction and I won't be leaving you anything." He walked out without waiting for an answer. Dale Pressler said yes. The deal closed 3 days before the scheduled auction. Eugene paid the bank $380,000. Dale signed over 600 acres. The man who had laughed at the junkyard Farmall was now indebted to the man who drove it. The man who had owned 2,200 acres now owned 1,600. The man who had sat on every board in the county sat on none. But he still had a farm. His children still had a home. And slowly, over the years that followed, Dale Pressler started to become a different kind of man. He sold the John Deere 4440 in 1987 and bought a used International that was 10 years old but ran fine. He stopped going to the dealership showroom to look at what was new. He started going to Eugene Holtz's barn to learn how to keep old equipment running. The two men never became friends exactly. But they became neighbors in the true sense, men who helped each other during planting and harvest, who nodded to each other at the feed store without needing words, who had arrived at a mutual respect through a path that neither of them had intended to walk. 1994, 15 years after the tractor pull, Dale Pressler suffered a heart attack while working his north field. Eugene found him. He had been driving past on his way to town and noticed Dale's tractor stopped in the middle of the field, engine still running, and stopped to check. He called the ambulance. He sat in the dirt beside Dale and kept him calm until the paramedics came. Dale survived, but the doctor said the farming was finished. The heart could not take it anymore. A month later, Dale came to Eugene with one final proposition. He wanted to sell the remaining 1,600 acres and he wanted Eugene to buy them. Anyone else would split the ground up, sell it off piece by piece. Eugene would keep it together and farm it right. Eugene thought about it for 3 days, then he said yes. He paid a fair price, not a discount, not a premium, just what the land was worth acre by acre. And when the papers were signed, he did something that surprised everyone in Buchanan County. He gave 400 acres to Dale's oldest son, Michael, free and clear. No payment, no conditions, just a deed with Michael's name on it. "Your grandfather built something here," Eugene told him. "Your father almost lost it, but that doesn't mean your family has to leave. This land knows your name." Eugene Holtz died in 2012 at the age of 77. He had outlived Dale Pressler by 18 years. He had farmed his land until he was 75 when his own son took over the operation. He never borrowed a dime. He never stopped driving old equipment. He never tried to be the biggest anything. The Farmall 560, the factory test mule that nobody knew was a factory test mule, the junkyard scrap that beat a brand new $45,000 John Deere in front of 2,147 people on a hot August afternoon, is still in the family barn. Eugene's grandson restored it a few years ago, stripped it to bare metal and rebuilt it from the ground up. It runs better now than it did in 1979. Every August during the county fair, they bring it out and park it near the tractor pull track. There is a small sign that tells the story, the bet, the pull, the upset, the $10,000 check written in public by a man who had been certain he could not lose. People stop and read the sign and look at the old red tractor and shake their heads. Hard to believe, they say, that rusty thing beat a brand new John Deere. But if you look closely at that Farmall, if you know where to look, you can still see the faint outline of a number stamped into the engine block. A test mule designation from 1962. The mark of an engineer at International Harvester who wanted to know how much power he could get out of a 560 frame. He got enough, more than enough. And all these years later, that tractor is still teaching the same lesson it taught Dale Pressler on the afternoon of August 18, 1979. Don't laugh at what you don't understand. Don't bet against people you haven't bothered to know. And never assume that what you see on the outside tells you anything reliable about what is underneath. The rust doesn't matter, the dents don't matter, the baling wire holding the fender on doesn't matter. What matters is what's in the heart of the machine, and what's in the heart of the man who drives it. Those two things, it turns out, are usually the same thing.